Добрый вечер или добрый день или доброе утро, неважно, какое время сейчас. Главное, мы всегда говорим, главное, чтобы оно было добрым. С вами Михаил Morgulis и программа «Духовная дипломатия». И вы помните наш обычай, мы всегда начинаем нашу программу с напоминанием вам о том, что все в этой жизни можно вернуть. И знаете, и деньги, и любовь иногда можно вернуть дружбу. А вот время никогда не возвращается. И чтобы мы с вами помнили об этом, мы запускаем наши кремлевские песочные куранты, чтобы напоминать вам и мне о том, что время не возвращается. И также у нас есть ключ, это волшебный ключ, мы так считаем, которым мы открываем ваши сердца и ваши души для задушевного разговора, чтобы не было в наших программах лицемерия, чтобы все было по-честному. Вы знаете, что у нас всегда присутствуют гости в нашей программе. Мы стараемся, чтобы эти гости были необыкновенными, чтобы они через призму своего восприятия жизни, через свой опыт жизни, через свою мудрость дали вам возможность в этой жизни преодолеть барьеры, трудности, печали, все то, с чем сталкивается человек в этой жизни. И мы сегодня пригласили к нам в студию необыкновенного гостя. Я 2 минуты скажу о нем, пару минут расскажу о нем. Это доктор Дэвид Hathaway. Дэвид Hathaway. И немножко надо сказать о нем. Он необыкновенный человек. Вы знаете, у него в жизни было много. Вообще его фамилия Hathaway означает путник, человек, который идет по жизни. Он верующий человек. Вы знаете, что за свою веру даже во времена советского тоталитаризма он был в Чехословакии арестован и пребывал в тюрьме целый год. Вообще его осудили на 5 лет, но благодаря личному вмешательству премьер-министра Англии его освободили раньше. В его жизни много было удивительного. Когда в Израиле еще не было государства Израиль, он приезжал, уже помогал людям организовывать это государство. В него стреляли мусульманские снайперы, но вот видите, он с нами, и все благополучно. Бог его сохранял. У него есть прекрасные книги, вот как несколько из них лежат рядом со мной. «Почему Сибирь?», «Чехословацкий мат», имеется в виду шахматы и тюрьма. И также, я также покажу программную его книгу, которая называется «Сила веры». «Сила веры». Это все книги, у него много еще других книг замечательных о том, похищение Европы, есть фильмы, книги. Это книги пророческие, я считаю. Это книги, которые нам дают возможность заглянуть в будущее. Ибо духовные люди, верующие люди обладают еще таким духовным механизмом, аппаратом, который позволяет заглянуть в будущее. Поэтому иногда таких людей называют пророками. Итак, у нас сегодня в гостях Дэвид Hathaway. Милости просим, будьте как дома, находясь у нас во Флориде. Дэвид, я буду вас называть по имени, потому что вы человек добрый, и не обязательно всегда повторять доктор, учитель, пророк. Я хочу вам задать пару вопросов. Вот вопрос первый у вас записан. Number one question. Что главное, вы считаете, что главное в жизни верующего человека?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be on your program, Dr. Morgulis. And I've got to know you recently, and we've done quite a bit of work together. But to answer your question, I really believe that the most important thing for a believer is the relationship with God through Jesus Christ. You see, the problem is there's so much religion in the world. There are so many different gods. But the one thing about the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, is that we can have a personal relationship with him, know him as Father through Jesus Christ. And that's why God sent his Son, so that God is not somebody unknowable, but someone that we can have a relationship with. You know, it's very interesting because a lot of people try not to believe in God. And of course, the whole basis of evolution, the theory of evolution, is to explain man's existence without God. But there's one thing that evolution cannot solve, and that's this question that man is a worshipping animal. Now, this is quite unique because no other animal has this, but man has this inner relationship, the desire to worship. And this is seen that whenever they've gone to even find remote tribes in Africa or in India, even on remote islands, all of those people have some kind of worship, whether they worship the sun, the moon, or animals, but it's worship. Now, that is a unique thing that God put within us. It is that desire to worship. And God put it there for a reason, because he wants us to worship him. And so this is the most important thing, is that relationship with him.
Some people, I know some people, they told me, we have each Sunday we go to church, we listen to pastor, we in this time touch our God, and we have a relationship with God. But my opinion, I believe you're absolutely right. Each person needs a private, personal relationship with God. What do you think about this?
Well, you're really touching on the truth, Doctor, because one can see a person, for example, on television, and with your program, there are people who see you and they recognize you, they watch your program. But it's a great difference between seeing you on television and having a personal relationship with you, where they can talk to you and can communicate with you. And the important thing of relationship is communication, and to be able to communicate both ways, with you and back with the person. And it's the same with God.
Yeah, you give me some symbolical picture. I think if we have a big family and we have a father in this family, if I stay with family around table, around dinner, and I talk sometimes with my father, but I need also conversation with this father face to face, eyes to eyes. Same, I believe, situation with God.
Dr. Morgulis, I remember many years ago my first visit to America. I was in New York, and I was invited to David Wilkerson's drug rehabilitation center. And being taken round, one thing I saw was, I've never forgotten, one of those drug addicts had written on the wall, "I know Jesus is alive because I talked to him this morning." And you know, that's the reality of Christian faith. I talked to him this morning.
Я знаю, что вы много времени, много своей жизни посвятили Израилю. И почему Израиль для вас так важен?
Well, it's a big question to answer. Firstly, Israel is important to me because of the importance in the Bible. And the fact that Jesus Christ lived there, that Israel was the home of the Jewish people. And all through history, I've always regarded Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. But for me, it has an even stronger significance, because my first visit there, which is 51 years ago, 1961, the first visit was to find something I was searching for. But that experience changed my whole life. And one of the reasons it changed my life was because I was quite poor. I didn't have the money to buy the ticket. I wanted to attend a conference which was going to be held at Pentecost, the feet of Pentecost. And I believed that if I could be there, something of what happened 2,000 years ago would be repeated in my life. But because I didn't have the money, I determined to go by road. And so I set up an expedition, 6,000 miles, return 10,000 kilometers. And I took a small group of people. Now, because I took 9 people, they paid. And it didn't cost me anything. I had to organize it. I had to provide the minibus, but it didn't actually cost me anything to go. But the journey took me behind the Iron Curtain, took me into the communist countries. I had to go into the former Yugoslavia and then into Bulgaria. And as you know, we always used to call Bulgaria Little Russia because the system there was as intense and as cruel as the Russian. And we were treated like criminals. And I can remember on that first journey, we were sleeping in tents, but we had to be in like a prison camp. Locked up, our passports taken away, the gates locked, secure guards. We weren't allowed to get out at all. And that began to open my eyes to the true situation. And later I was to meet a pastor, and I discovered that he was Popov, Harold Popov. He'd been sentenced to, I think, 20 years or something, and served 14 years in prison in Bulgaria. And now I was traveling through Bulgaria, seeing it and realizing the persecution. And that opened my eyes to the reality of the persecution of the Christian believers under communism. Then, of course, I was to go to Israel and see the results of the Holocaust and the persecution of the Jewish people. Those two things together were to change my whole life.
Sometimes I think, Dr. Hathaway, Israel, it's not only country, it's not only people who live in this country, it's a special atmosphere, special condition where is live also God. God not face, God atmosphere, God's condition, not only people condition. And I think sometimes we forgot about Israel. It's not only country, it's a gift and signal what we have for us from God. What you think about this?
Well, it's absolutely true. And the interesting thing is, it is a place where God revealed himself through his Son. And I've been, as you know, I've been more than 70 times to Israel over the years. But it's a revelation of finding God there amongst the people. You know, a country is nothing without the people. The people are the country. And it's very much so in Israel. And I noticed it because traveling across Europe, 1,000 miles across Turkey, on that journey, and of course, in the first years, I was always going by road. It became a travel company. I was taking thousands of people. But going down then through Syria and crossing into Jordan, and then coming up from Jericho and from the Jordan Valley up to Jerusalem, which is the way the Bible always speaks about it, they went up to Jerusalem, but it was the people. And the contrast between the people on either sides of the frontier was so enormous, because the Jewish people, they're so different to the Arab people, and they reflect the very life of God and the power of God. And even today, as you know, Israel is part of Europe, but it's one of the most prosperous countries. The Jewish people are so hardworking. You know, you become impressed. What is it? But it's the God spirit in them that motivates them. Right. And so I admire the Jewish people. And in fact, I'm not Jewish, but I wish I were. I actually said that on my last visit to Israel. I wish I were Jewish. I so admire the Jewish people.
I know why, because you're God's man and because you understand Jewish hearts.
Yes, yes.
Когда вы были в тюрьме в советской Чехословакии, я знаю, что это нелегко, это тяжело пребывать в тюрьме человеку, привыкшему к свободе. Какая мысль чаще всего приходило к вам в разум?
Well, to answer your question,
Yes.
What I was thinking about most, I suppose the simple thing is, of course, is I was married, I had a family at home,
Right.
and my thoughts were with my family. But also not only that, but my thoughts were of God. I spent a lot of time in prayer in the prison, partly because I realized there was only one way to get out. But as you know, I was imprisoned because of Bible smuggling and for preaching the gospel. You see, once I'd set up this overland route into Israel, and then the Six-Day War closed the route into Israel, God directed me into the communist countries. And I had licenses to take tourists into all the communist countries. I had freedom, actually, to travel, which gave me a freedom to take Bibles. I converted one of the buses so that with a special compartment, it would carry 2 tons of Bibles every time I went. Now, this was a massive operation. And in effect, I became a professional smuggler in that sense. But when I was in the prison, I was denied my Bible. And every time I asked to have a Bible, they always said, it's this filthy book, and they would curse and they would swear about the Bible. It's this filthy book is the reason that you're here. But the amazing thing is that after I'd been in for 9 months, God worked a miracle. And I laugh and I say, well, I was a professional smuggler. I actually managed to smuggle a Bible into my cell. Now, it was amazing how I did it, because my Bible was in my baggage, which was kept in a cellar under the prison. But the British consul was visiting me, and we weren't allowed our own clothes. Of course, we only had prison clothes. And I was asking to be able to get some warm clothes for the winter. And the officers refused, but eventually the British consul persuaded them to let me go down. And they said, all right, just one time you can go down, you can get some warm clothes. And of course, when I got down there, the first thing I saw in my baggage was the Bible. And so I forgot all about clothes. I just grabbed the first clothes I could see, hid the Bible, and I was actually able to get it back into the cell. So I was the only prisoner in the whole prison that had a Bible. And that became a key, because, you know, the Bible is the very center of the Christian's life. And before I had the Bible, something very unusual happened. I was getting letters from people in England, and they wrote different things and would quote from the Bible, but I got this letter from somebody, and it was signed from John and Ruth. Well, I didn't know who they were. And then another letter came from on the same paper, and it was a distinctive paper and the same writing, but it said this one was from Peter and Matthew. And I thought, that's strange. And then I realized what they were doing was, the whole letter was quoting scripture, and the book was the name of the person. So Matthew and Peter, it was from the Gospel of Matthew and one of Peter's epistles. And I was actually able to use these scriptures to preach the gospel in the prison even before I had my Bible. So it's quite an amazing story. But you say, what were my thoughts in the prison? Well, of course, the thought in any prisoner's mind is how to get out.
First time, after first decision of court, you have, if I remember well, 5 years decision of court, 5 years in Czechoslovakian jail. You not know in this time you will be freed, you will have a free after 1 year. And like you said, stay in jail with this idea, you have 5 years in jail. What you think, what will give you more quiet and more enjoy in your heart? What?
Well, to be quite honest, Dr. Morgulis, it wasn't only the 5-year sentence, but what I discovered, and I did discuss this with the British consul on one of his visits, I found that they would give you a relatively easy sentence, because in communist prisons, as you know, 5 years was not a long sentence. 20 years was more likely. But what I found was that while you were there, they would find some other accusation against you. And this was brought home to me because a young man was brought into my cell. He'd been sentenced to only a short sentence, 2 or 3 years. He'd been released, and as he went out of the prison, he was rearrested and brought back in. And they accused him that in his first sentence, he'd made statements against the government and against the president, which he had not done. But he was then to serve another sentence. And I found out that they were actually preparing another accusation against me because I was preaching the gospel in the prison. And I feared that I would have a second 5-year sentence. And even what they were saying to me was, in the prison, they were saying, you will never get out alive. You would die in this prison. So it was a really serious thing. So the only thing which comforted me was that I knew I was there as part of God's purpose for my life. And I looked at the other prisoners, and they all developed a nervous shake because of they said virtually every prisoner at that time in Czechoslovakia. And they also told me 1 person in every 3 in Czechoslovakia, a lawyer told me, 1 person in every 3 in Czechoslovakia went into the prison. And they developed the shake because they had no spiritual background. But what changed me was a realization, look, I'm in here because I was serving God. God has a purpose in my being here, and God is the only one who can get me out. And then it became a challenge to pray my way out. And the miracle was that after the trial, when they were very angry with me and they were calling me every kind of criminal, the thing was that 2 days after the trial, I had a dream. And the first trial was after 4 months. But because I appealed against it, I had to stay another 2 months. So 6 months before the final verdict. But after that first trial, I had a dream. And God actually, in that dream, showed me the day that I would be released. Now, I couldn't believe it, because I knew that the churches to which I belonged in England, every Easter had a big convention in the largest auditorium in London. And in the dream, I saw myself out of the prison in that auditorium speaking to 10,000 people. Well, that was crazy. I was going to be in prison for years. How could I be in London and be in the Royal Albert Hall for this Easter? So I just couldn't even accept it. But the more I prayed, I then began to pray into that dream. But when, after 9 months, I got my Bible, when I was reading the Bible, God confirmed the dream from the Bible. Then I knew, after 9 months, that it would happen. And so I then began to pray into that. So the thing which kept me different to the other prisoners was my faith in God, and my faith in a God who could deliver me even from a communist prison.
Спасибо, спасибо. Да, что я понял, что Дэвид говорит очень важную вещь. Доктор Hathaway сказал очень важную вещь. У нас бывают сны обычные, а бывают сны, посланные нам Богом. Если в нас живет вера, вера в того, кто послал этот сон обязательно исполнится. Так было в его жизни. Вы много раз посещали Израиль, вы много путешествовали. Я смотрел фильмы о вас, когда вы в Израиле. И, может быть, в вашей памяти, в вашей душе остался самый яркий эпизод, который сохранился у вас об Израиле.
Well, I think there are 3 particular things that affected me in Israel. The first was, my first visit was to attend a conference. and it was a conference of Pentecostal people to be held on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem. Now, I believe the Jewish prophet Joel prophesied first rain and the last rain. And I believe that the day of Pentecost was the first rain on the land, and that the last rain, the latter rain, is the present outpouring of the Holy Spirit, which we have now on the church.
Right.
And I was there as a young evangelist because I wanted a new outpouring of the fire of God, because I believe in God's power and God's fire in my life. And nothing actually happened, and I was bitterly disappointed, because it seemed that of 3,000 people in the conference, there were 2,999 tourists and me. But yet I was to discover that that first visit to Israel was to change the whole of my life. So God did actually work. The second thing was that when I got there, on the way to Israel, I was to visit the concentration camp in Dachau in Germany, just outside Munich. That touched me. When I arrived in Israel, I found that Adolf Eichmann was on trial.
Right.
And of course, he was accused of mass murder of the Jews. But I think the thing which probably affected me most about Israel was from that time, 1961, it became a travel company. I was going up to 8 times a year, and I was taking hundreds of thousands of people in. But in 1967, I was actually there when the Six-Day War started. And I had 2 groups. I was on the Jordanian side because in those days Jerusalem was divided. We approached Israel through Jordan, came up to Jerusalem. The old city was in Jordanian hands. Then we crossed through the Mandelbaum Gate into the Israeli side. Well, the tour company had developed so much that I now had 2 groups, and I would have one group going in that side and the other group coming in by sea into Israel, and they would change over. But when the war started, I could tell something was happening, and the British consul told me to get out. And I refused. I'm quite a rebellious person, and I refused to get out because we wanted to see as much as possible. We actually wondered whether we would ever be able to go back to Israel because of the fighting. But the thing that frightened me was I was on the Arab side in East Jerusalem, and aeroplanes started dropping leaflets down, and I said to the owner of the hotel, "What do these leaflets say?" He said, "It's telling every Arab man to go and collect a rifle and 20 rounds of ammunition." And I thought, if every Arab is going to have a rifle and ammunition, I'd better get out. But what I actually did on that last day, I sent the tourists off so they could see as much as possible. And I went to Calvary, where we call it Gordon's Calvary, the Garden Tomb. And I spent the day there, and I saw the gun on the top of the hill. I climbed up on the top of the hill. It was just a Muslim graveyard, but because of the war, I was able to get there. And I spent the time with my friend, and tragically, he was one of the victims of the war, and that's the last time I was to see him. And when I was to go back after the war, they had buried him in the garden. And you know, that made the story of Jesus so much more real, because Jesus was buried there by those who loved him, his family, his friends. And it brought home, seeing a grave where they'd laid my friend, it brought home the reality of the death of Jesus in a very remarkable way. But of course, the Six-Day War was a tremendous thing, because we were taking tourists there in those old days. And on the walls of Jerusalem, if I took my tourists on the walls, the snipers would shoot at them.
Right.
Because especially if we were on the Israeli side, they would shoot at them. And when we went up to Galilee, there was a kibbutz Ein Gev on the far side of Galilee, but it was in Syrian territory. And on the top of the hill, the Golan Heights, were the Syrian guns. And I would send my tourists across Galilee on a boat, and I would have to drive my bus round watching the gunfire. And you could see the puff of smoke when they were firing the shells. And it was an exposed road, and my buses, which were blue and white, the Israeli colors, were a target for the guns. So I warn even the members of the Knesset, you cannot go back to those. You cannot give back the West Bank. You cannot give up East Jerusalem. It's just not possible. Israel could not exist under those conditions. So really, it was quite a political issue for me.
Спасибо, доктор Hathaway. К сожалению, наша программа подходит к концу. Я впечатлен, очень впечатлен вашим рассказом. Я думаю, что многие наши люди, слушающие нас, люди, понимающие, что такое боль и страдания, что такое свобода, желание быть свободным, они хорошо поняли вас. И сейчас, заканчивая нашу программу, я хотел бы, чтобы вы сказали несколько слов от вашего сердца людям, которые смотрят и слушают нас.
Well, let me just say to those of you who are watching this, what I found through all of this was personal relationship with the man, Jesus. I know that he doesn't live there now. I know he died there 2,000 years ago. But the very association of the land was to find the real Jesus. You know, today people get such a religious idea of who he is. I want you to know him as I have found him, as a loving Savior who forgave my sin and died for me. If only you could know him like that.
Спасибо. Ну что ж, дорогие друзья, мы должны прощаться с вами. Вы слушали, что говорил доктор Hathaway, некоторые мои комментарии. Я думаю, что важное, самое важное было сказано сегодня, что подтверждено, что помимо физической жизни в этом мире существует огромная духовная жизнь, о которой мы так часто забываем в суете наших дней. Давайте помним об этом, давайте помнить об этом, простите, давайте помнить так, чтобы в нашей жизни присутствовало то, о чем говорил доктор Hathaway, живое присутствие Бога, который пришел на эту землю для всех народов, для иудеев и для всех других народов, живущих на этой планете. Давайте будем помнить об этом и будем беречь наши души. И я с вами прощаюсь, с вами был наш гость доктор Дэвид Hathaway из Англии. С вами был Mikhail Morgulis, это я, и программа «Духовная дипломатия». Всего вам доброго, храни вас Бог.